Welcome everyone. I'm here to begin this lengthy review for our test on Wednesday. I modified the test a little bit, so maybe it'll be a little bit more manageable in terms of time. But please don't worry, relax, pay attention carefully to this review. I'm going to go through everything in enough detail for you. And if you have any questions, send them my way. So remember, the test is going to be chronological. It's going to start. The first question will be on Alexander Hamilton, and it will go all the way to the end, although I don't think I'm going to ask about Obama and Trump. So anyway, time period 3, 1754 to 1800. I gave you a little timeline there. That's not going to be tested, but it is information that I hope you will know by the end of the year. And the first question will be to discuss the different components of Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. If you recall, Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury selected by George Washington. And before he created his plan, he did a whole report and study on the economic landscape of the United States, or the new United States, I should say. And after he made all of his conclusions based on all of the research, he decided that it would be great if the United States had one consolidated national debt to help unify these 13, at the time, independent states. So the first thing is all state debts would have to be consolidated into one national debt. But then there were people, individual citizens, who held treasury bonds, and he decided to pay off those bonds at face value. So whatever the bond was worth, he would give them the full value up front so that we didn't have outstanding debts. Some people believe that that aspect of his plan did favor the wealthy because poorer American citizens were compelled to sell their bonds earlier during the Articles of Confederation and when they did not get anywhere near the full value. Now, once this entire national debt is created, Alexander Hamilton would like to pay it off. And he was going to raise money through two measures. First, he was going to ask for a protective tariff on all imports, and then the second was going to be an excise tax on the sale of whiskey. You might recall, farmers in Pennsylvania were not pleased with this, and that led to their whiskey rebellion. I probably should have said this earlier, but he did want to have one uniform currency for the United States. At the time, each state had its individual currency. And then possibly the most controversial part of his plan was the creation of a national bank, and this was challenged by Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State. They had a few cabinet rap battles as a result of it, and the solution to this conflict, which centered around the Constitution, Hamilton believed that he had the right to create a national bank because the Constitution did not say he couldn't do it. Jefferson, on the other hand, at the time, was being more of a strict interpreter of the Constitution and wanted to prevent him from creating the national bank. So between the national bank and the fact that southern states didn't have the same level of debt as the rest of the country, Hamilton made a compromise. The deal in the room where it happened said that the capital, which was in New York City, would be moved closer to the south to the Potomac River area, and it would be named Washington, D.C. So that is how Hamilton was able to get his plan through. All right, so now we go to time period 4, and this is 1800 to 1848. So this is when Jefferson is elected, and then there is the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, there's an era of good feelings when allegedly there was only one political party and minimal political conflict. That can be debated later on. That came to an end with the election of 1824, the corrupt bargain election, which I'll go through later. And then the age of Jackson, the victim of the corrupt bargain. So first, what are these primary causes of the War of 1812? It really revolves around impressment. The Chesapeake Leopard affair is when the U.S. ship, the Chesapeake, was attacked by the British ship, the Leopard. And impressment is just when sailors were being kidnapped off of ships, being forced to work on foreign ships. Many countries were picking on the United States at this time. Other causes of the War of 1812 were the fact that there were some war hawks in Congress, namely Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who were looking to expand, mostly looking to go into Canada. And then the last cause would be Native American attacks, where on the frontier, Native Americans were being encouraged by the British to wage some attacks against the American settlers. So after this Chesapeake Leopard affair, the initial response of Congress when Jefferson was president was the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act simply said, we are not going to trade with anybody. That's it. No trade at all. This will be lessened when President Madison takes office, and it is Madison who will be the president who declares war at this time. All right, so now we move to what were the economic and political results of the War of 1812? Well, because of that Embargo Act, we were compelled to make goods ourselves. So manufacturing, even on the short term, it had a negative impact on the economy, and Jefferson faced some pressure with that. Manufacturing increased tremendously over the long haul. Also, because it was considered another American victory, although that can be debated by historians, there was a great increase in nationalism in America. And then the result that I would really like you all to remember, the Federalist Party died out as a political challenger to the Democratic Republicans. That is why we have this era of good feelings where there is only one political party in the United States. At this time, during the era of good feelings, Henry Clay is a very prominent figure, but then again, he's a prominent figure in almost all of American history, and he devised this American system. His idea was that we should focus on infrastructure, build up our roads and our canals, and these internal improvements were a critical part of what he was looking to bring to the country. He also supported a protective tariff, again, that would help to encourage American manufacturing, and he wanted to continue with the national bank. You'll have to decide if you think this is an original plan or that he may have taken some things from Alexander Hamilton. Okay, so now I don't have this on a slide, but I am just going to share with you one thing that's on the test. You do need to know two examples of technological improvements that took place in the United States during this time. And I'll give you a couple of examples that you could use. These are short answer questions, by the way. Farm tools improved. We had better drills, mowers, rakes, plows. That type of farm technology is going to make it, it's going to reduce the costs that it's going to take for farmers to do their work. Also, steamboats are a big component of this time period. Canals, railroads, roads, turnpikes. These are all transportation innovations that reduce the time that it will take to ship goods. This will open up eastern markets to frontier farmers. So just be aware of those changes. And then in terms of the different parts of the country, the North prospers from this because now the roads and the canals are going to connect different regions, and that leads to early industrialization and large-scale manufacturing. You'll even see the development of cities, urban and commercial centers, and more job opportunities, and that is why you're going to see many immigrants flood into the northern cities. As far as the South is going to rely on farming as a large part of its economy, so they're very agricultural based, but unfortunately that will lead to increases in slavery, and that will lead to increased sectional tensions. As far as the West, big component of their development is the railroads, and that will lead to more people moving out west eventually, and you'll see immigrant populations there as well. So you don't have to know all of that, but just have a general understanding of the impact that these technologies had on people. So now let's get to Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson's elected in 1828. I'm not going to go through the corrupt bargain right now. It's not on the test, and I've taught it, and we'll talk about it later on, but that's the election where I just said I'm not going to talk about it, and then I started talking about it. But that's the election where we believe that Henry Clay made a secret deal with John Quincy Adams to help him get elected when the election went to the House of Representatives, because no candidate received a majority. And I'm going to stop now. But anyway, Andrew Jackson will be number 7 after John Quincy Adams. And early in his administration, there was a little bit of a conflict revolving around the lady Peggy O'Neill Timberlake, who met John Eaton, who was the Secretary of War and a good friend of Andrew Jackson's, and there were some problems with each of their marriages, and those ended, and Peggy O'Neill Timberlake became Peggy Eaton. She became the cabinet member's wife. The vice president's wife, Florida Calhoun, did not care for her and asked the other cabinet ladies to shun her, and this led to a split between Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun, who was the vice president, and almost led to a civil war because John C. Calhoun will later resign as vice president, go back to South Carolina, which you may know is the first state to secede from the Union. Now, the specific controversy economically revolved around the tariff. The South called this the Tariff of Abominations, believing that it hurt the South far more than it hurt the rest of the country. And John C. Calhoun sparked a nullification crisis when he said, we, the South Carolinians, are not going to pay the tariff. Jackson said, you most certainly are, and convinced Congress to pass the Force Bill, which said we will use the military to make you pay the tariff. Could we have gone to civil war right there? This is, by the way, around 1832, 1833. We most certainly could. But who saved the day? Yes, that is right, Henry Clay, who came up with a compromise tariff that would gradually lower the tariff rates. And that is not it for Jackson, because we also have the bank war for Jackson. Henry Clay, as you know, was a supporter of the National Bank. And the election of 1832 was coming up, and Henry Clay had his eyes on the presidency. So he proposed to his friend, Nicholas Biddle, the bank president, that we put a bill before Jackson now to extend the National Bank, even though the charter was not going to expire for 4 years. And they were pretty confident Jackson would veto the bill, since he was known as King Veto, having vetoed more bills than the first 6 presidents combined. And that would help Henry Clay get elected because he'd be able to use it in his campaign with the people. Well, all of that happened. The only thing that did not happen is that Henry Clay did not win the election, and Jackson was given a second term. Jackson did not stop there. He even told his vice president, Martin Van Buren, that the bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it first. And that is what he did. He had his Secretary of the Treasury remove all the federal funds from the National Bank, but of course he can't keep it for himself. So he had them placed in state banks, and whichever states he favored, they were referred to as pet banks. Please recall that several of his Treasury secretaries would not do this, so he dismissed them. The one who finally was willing to do it was Roger Taney, Taney, somebody that I will be teaching about later in the year. Jackson also had a very controversial policy called his Specie Circular that was requiring people to pay for things in gold and silver, and there was a real estate bubble. Well, I don't want to use real estate bubble. There was a land speculation, might be a better way, out west where people were just buying up land at a very alarming rate, and when they were now required to pay for things in gold and silver, it led to a lot of foreclosures, and some people think that contributed to the Panic of 1837. And I know some of you are fans of Martin Van Buren, first president born in the United States. However, he got the reputation for being called Martin Van Ruin because the economy tanked a little bit. All right, good job. We're moving at a nice pace. Next time period is your Civil War Reconstruction time period, which I will teach in its entirety in January when we get to African American history. So that will not be on the test. But the Gilded Age most certainly will be on the test. And this time period of the late 1800s has many different aspects to it. We have the rise of big business, the growth of monopolies, there's industrialization, age of inventions, cities are growing, urbanization, and then when we talk on the growth of labor unions, and then we talk about the West, the frontier is developing, that leads to conflict with Native Americans. So this is a major time period for us to learn about. And the term Gilded Age was given by author Mark Twain, who was referring to the fact that on the surface America looked very prosperous. However, underneath there was tremendous poverty, and this increasing gap between the rich and the poor is something that alarms individuals. The government's policy at the time was laissez-faire, which is a hands-off policy, minimal government involvement, minimal regulation. Please remember there were no income taxes at this time. And men like Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Cornelius Vanderbilt made tremendous sums of money. You've already written an essay about the gospel of wealth and, the social. I think you're familiar with social Darwinism. I'm not putting any of that on the test. But this Gilded Age time period is very critical to the understanding of the development of America. And we're going to continue with the Gilded Age, and I'm going to ask you to write briefly about two of the conflicts. One was the Haymarket Riot. This was when the Knights of Labor, a labor union, was protesting for 8-hour workdays and better wages and better conditions. This is in Chicago, by the way. But there were also a group of anarchists who were there. And we don't know who, but somebody threw a bomb at the police. It led to 7 cops being killed and another bystander also dying. And they arrested the anarchists, but the real long-term impact of this was that people still associated it with the Knights of Labor and blamed them for the problems. All right. Then we go to the Pullman Strike. And in 1893, a panic hit in the United States. Again, economic panic. So George Pullman made some decisions. As the owner of Pullman Town, he was the inventor of a sleeping car for the railroad, but he also built a place for his workers to live. Nice little park and apartments and everything in a little community. But they, of course, had to pay him rent. When the panic hit, he decided to lower their wages, which I think is understandable. However, he kept their rent the same, which is where the problems originated. So the leader of the union, whose name was Eugene V. Debs, a future socialist candidate for president, organized a strike. And this strike shut down over 60% of railroad traffic in the country. Grover Cleveland, who was the president at the time, this is the second Grover Cleveland administration, decided to get a court order injunction to force the workers back on the job. And his defense was that the railroad delivers mail, which is a federal agency, and therefore they could not interfere with its shipment. So this shows that at the time during the Gilded Age, it appeared that the presidency, or the federal government, was more on the side of big business and not on the side of the workers. And that will be the end of the Gilded Age, and then we will now go to time period 7, which tends to be a bit of a monster here, but it's the Progressive Era, along with other topics. We have not done foreign policy yet, so imperialism, World War I, and World War II will come later, but we have talked about the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. Just be aware that some historians today don't even like to consider the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era to be separate. They like to think that there is just maybe that it's one big time period where the government was debating its role in regulating business. Because the traditional view of the Progressive Era is that now it is a time of more government regulation to resolve the problems that originated during the Gilded Age. And there's nothing wrong with you using that understanding. But I just wanted you to understand that historians are always constantly debating, learning more, and evaluating history as time goes on. So the leading Progressive Era president was Theodore Roosevelt. How did Theodore Roosevelt become president? Well, that would be due to the assassination of William McKinley. And Theodore Roosevelt, his vice president, took over in 1901, and his domestic program was called the Square Deal. He was hoping that all Americans would have an equal opportunity to achieve the success that we want in this country. And he's definitely more of a hands-on president. His Square Deal, the basic components of this would be, he looked out for the consumers. The book The Jungle, remember the spark for the Progressive Era would be all of the muckrakers who were writing about the problems. And Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed the horrific conditions in the meatpacking industry. So consumer protection is a big component, and he does convince Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Now, he's also known as the Trust Buster. He was willing to break up trusts that he thought were not in the best interest of the people. But he doesn't break up all trusts. He did distinguish between good trusts and bad trusts. And the president after Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, actually broke up twice as many trusts as Roosevelt in half the time. He's a conservationist, cares about irrigation projects and preserving land for national forests and parks. And in terms of labor, Roosevelt was far more interested in looking out for the worker than the presidents during the Gilded Age. Just don't want you to think that he was completely on the side of labor. He's really more on the side of the general people in the population. And the best example of that is when anthracite coal miners went on strike in 1902. And at this time, it was as winter was approaching, he was very concerned that the people would not have heat. So he told the owners of the mines and the labor union leaders to come to the White House and resolve the strike immediately. If they did not do so, he was threatening to take over the coal mines. And that just shows how he was willing to use the presidency to look out for the interests of the people. Now we continue with time period 7, and I told you William Howard Taft is going to follow Teddy Roosevelt, and he was not as progressive in some respects as Roosevelt had hoped. It was a bit of a mixed bag. So even though Roosevelt was a big fan of Taft when he left office, he was disappointed overall, especially when he fired Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the Forest Service, who was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. So Roosevelt decides he's going to come back and run for a third term, which he was allowed to do at that time. But I guess the people were not in favor of it, and they went with William Taft as a Republican nominee anyway. Roosevelt did not stop there. He said, I will run as a progressive candidate. He named his party the Bull Moose Party. Woodrow Wilson received the Democratic nomination. And then there is that fourth candidate, Eugene V. Debs, who you might recall from the Pullman Strike a few minutes ago. And he is the socialist candidate for president. The significance of this election is that Roosevelt and Taft really did split the Republican vote. So if you look at the results, if only one of them had run, there's a very good chance he would have been the next president. But Wilson benefited from this, and even though the Electoral College vote, I think it was 435 for Wilson and only 88 for Roosevelt and 8 for Taft, but a closer analysis would indicate that the election should have gone to one of the Republican candidates. Nevertheless, it is Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, who takes the White House. And the most important thing I'd like you to know about him is that the Federal Reserve was created at that time, 1913. Federal Reserve today, I showed you the money. It regulates the money supply and regulates interest rates. The chairman of the Federal Reserve today is Janet Yellen. And about a week ago, she actually announced that they were increasing interest rates. That's usually a sign that the Fed thinks that the economy is doing well. I don't know if everybody agrees with that, but this decision, we will see the long-term impact of this later on. All right. Now we continue with time period 7, and we go to the 1920s, the Roaring '20s, when the presidents were Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, all Republican presidents, all with the Secretary of the Treasury by the name of Andrew Mellon, and all who supported tax cuts on the wealthy. The income tax just started with the 16th Amendment, and this was a graduated income tax that had different tax brackets for individuals based on their income levels. This tax policy is a more conservative approach and will be followed later on during the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. And now we're going to go to time period 8. Well, let me just backtrack for a second. There are going to be questions about the New Deal, the Great Depression, but you've written an essay on that, and I have a video on that. I think you'll do fine on those questions. So now we go to time period 8, and 1940. This is the post-World War II era. And these are just now a few random questions all the way through. So what was the marginal tax rate? That's the highest tax bracket during the 50s. It was 91%. But remember, that doesn't mean that people actually paid 91%. Their tax rate was actually much lower than it is today. Eisenhower was president for most of the 1950s, and his greatest legislative achievement was the interstate highway system. Remember, with the 5 stars, because he was a 5-star general. After Eisenhower will be Kennedy, but he will not be on this test. But when Kennedy's assassinated, we then have LBJ take over. I know some of you are fans of LBJ as well. And LBJ, after reading a book called The Other America by Michael Harrington, decided to create his domestic agenda called the Great Society. He was looking for a war on poverty. This is another very liberal agenda, probably the second most liberal agenda since FDR. And this includes Medicare, which is health care for the elderly, and Medicaid, which is health care for people in poverty. We're going to continue. And And now we get to the 1970s, and this was a difficult time for the nation. The presidents, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, all to a certain degree dealt with a weakening economy. So the conditions mostly were sparked by the embargo that OPEC placed on oil. So the oil crisis was the 1970s. There were gas lines during the 1970s. People at two different times were only able to buy gas on odd or even days based on their license plate. People were stealing gas from each other. That's even why we have our February break to shut down the school and try to conserve oil for a week. There was high inflation, high unemployment. Sometimes economists refer to these conditions as stagflation. And there was also, I haven't taught you about Watergate yet, but there was a distrust of the presidency in general. So the 70s economically was a difficult time for the United States. Then we get to the 1980s to the present, and again, there's going to be some Reagan questions as well, but I've done so much on Reagan that I don't think I need to review that with you at all. Please feel free to ask questions in class. But Reagan's vice president, George Bush, took office in 1988, or the election of 88, and at the convention, he spoke directly to the camera and said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then when he did decide to raise taxes toward the end of his administration, some people think that contributed to his loss to Bill Clinton, although it was probably a combination of that and the third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who received almost 19% of the vote. Bill Clinton's economic contributions to the country would be NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which eliminates tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And you all know that he's also the president who repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, which was an attempt to free up the Wall Street to engage in more risky behavior. And North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan was the man who predicted that this would be something we would regret. But during Bill Clinton's presidency, that is the last time we had a surplus. So let me make this all clear to you. Deficit and surplus are terms we only use for 1 year of the economy, 1 year of the budget. If we spend more money than we bring in as a government, as a federal government, and this can be on the state level also, that's called a deficit. We're spending more, we don't have as much. But if we bring in more money than we spend, then that is called a surplus. And we did have 3 years of a surplus when Bill Clinton was president. If my memory is correct, those were 3 years where Bill Clinton was a Democrat, obviously, and Congress was more Republican. But that does not mean that we didn't have a national debt. National debt is the total money that the country owes, and the national debt would only be able to be paid off if we continue to have a surplus after a surplus year after year. That surplus ended when George Bush became president, or during his presidency. George Bush, who we all know dealt with 9/11, supported the Bush tax cuts, which were tax cuts for the wealthy, so they lowered the rates at that time. Those rates were then increased yet again when Obama became president. And your last two things here, the Affordable Care Act. When President Obama was in office, he made health care one of his priorities. Some of the conditions you should know about the Affordable Care Act are the fact that children can stay on their parents' plan until they are 26, that companies cannot deny people coverage due to pre-existing conditions, women cannot be charged more than men for health insurance. The mandate requires everybody get health insurance. Companies are required to provide health insurance if they have 50 full-time workers, and there's a fine if somebody does not get health insurance. And there's also an exchange that if you cannot afford health insurance, the government will try to help link you up and give you some subsidies. That's a very abbreviated version of a 1,000-page bill. The Affordable Care Act could be repealed under President Trump, and the other change that he may make is that he might lower tax rates for a few people, and he might make fewer tax brackets. So I tried to keep this under 30 minutes. I hope that my dog snoring did not get in the way, but I did provide you with a pretty decent review of what you would need to know for the test. There are going to be some questions that are based obviously on readings, and that's stuff that I can't really go over, but it'll be a good evaluation. If you know all this information, you should be in good shape. And again, I will probably talk a little bit about it in class as well. And that's a 30-minute mark. Everybody have a great day, and I will see you on Monday.